you for inviting me to come today. I think some of you maybe know more about the 35 flood than I do. I know there's some of you that was, so how many of you know, have an attachment to the flood? Quite a few of you. So I hope as we go through our story today, I'll just get back here and I'll go through my slides, that if you have a story to share, please just interrupt and tell me about it. So I got interested in the Republican River flood because we were actually doing a study about the Dust Bowl. As you all know, it was pretty dry for a few years around here. We were studying the effects of the Dust Bowl, and we got to hearing all these stories about the Republican flood, and there was a lot of people that said, "What flood?" And so we got to doing more and more research and finding out what an interesting event this was. If you picked up a brochure, they were laying over there on the table. If not, please get one. In the middle portion there, it shows the Republican River Valley. The valley extends 50 miles, goes from in Colorado through a little portion of Kansas by St. Francis, and then over through Nebraska, and then leaves Nebraska at about Superior and goes back down into Kansas. This is a weather map from May 30th of 1935. What happened that day was that there was a low pressure area that was across the Four Corners area of Arizona, New Mexico. Those always bring a lot of moisture into our area. There was also a low pressure over the area up in the Dakotas that was moving towards the Great Lakes. It was also very richly laden with moisture. Well, what happened was instead of this easterly flow like that northern low usually did, it turned and met the low that was coming up from the Four Corners area. This created a huge storm that came in the night. It started during the night with great lightning and thunder and 24 inches of rain. The largest amount of rain that's ever fallen that has been recorded in the continental United States fell in eastern Colorado that night. Well, as you can see by your little maps, there's a ladder of rivers that feeds the Republican, and all these rivers and streams and creeks were flooding. This resulted in a huge amount of damage. If you translate this into what would happen now, it'd be like a small Katrina. It would be like the effects of the hurricane as far as the horrible damage that it did here. As you can see in this area, 110 confirmed deaths. There were probably more, but people that were on the highways, they would have just disappeared. They may not have even known they were there. The livestock, you can see the amount of livestock, 20,000 head, unknown amounts of poultry, 830 miles of highways, highway bridges. Farmland was devastated. It was buried between. I was reading a story not too long ago about a farmer not too far from here that was in the Nebraska Living magazine, and he had a sand pit, and he was cleaning out his sand pit for some fill sand, and he was down 6 feet, and he found the corn rows from the farm that had been where that sand pit is now. So that's how much sand was deposited by the flood. Railroad information, we don't have a lot to share because the railroads really didn't tell their business to the government or to state agencies. We do know that each railroad bridge would have cost $1 million then, which you would take by 15 now, so each would have been about $15 million to repair. You can see how many bridges there were, so you can do the math and figure out how many $1 million that was. With all this millions of dollars of damage, some of it even untold, because like the appraised value of a farm before the flood would have been $45,000. After the flood, it was worth $450. It was just ruined. So that was all those years of profit gone, future profit gone down the drain. If you travel around our area, you probably hear people that say, "Oh, this country is so flat, there's just nothing." But if you live here, you realize that there are lots of valleys, and there's lots of gullies, and there's lots of places where the water feeds in and the banks are high. This area is known for having just a certain amount of topsoil, and then below that is rock. So when the waters come, there's no place for the water to go but to rush away with the topsoil, leaving the rock exposed. To think about the 1935, we have to put our minds back to that time, and I know some of you can tell these stories better than I can, but there were lots of farms. Farms were not too far apart. Survivors not too long ago, and she told me that when they walked to school, they never got out of the sight of one farm place before they were in the sight of another farm place. So there was lots of small farms spread throughout the area. Families were usually large. This family that's shown here is the Guthrie family, and they're from Indianola, and this is the 8 children that survived the flood. The parents aren't in the picture. Their age ranges is from 20 to 1. The baby there is 1. It had been very dry during that time period. 1934 was the driest year on record in this area. Maybe some of you remember the dust storms that happened during that time. I know my mother-in-law told me about the dust storms on their farm, and when she would wake up, there would be a place where her head had been on the pillow, and the pillow was covered with dust. So people were in more of a drought mode when 1935 dawned that year. It had been dry, no rain. Then about the 1st of May, it started to rain a little bit in this area. A shower, then a dust storm, then a shower, then a dust storm. Then about mid-May, there was some nice rains, and people had hopes that there might be crops in 1935. This is an actual record of the rain that fell in McCook. It's hard to read because it was an old document, but you can see there in the column that has the T, I think it's column number 7, the 1st and 2nd, there was a trace of rain, and there was a few days where it said there was a dust storm, trace of rain. Then you can see mid-month there started to be little nice rains off and on until the end of the month when the flood came. This shows how much rain fell during that time, and you can see it was kind of spotty. As I'd mentioned before, there was 24 inches of rain in Colorado. That's that pinkish purple area where it was 9+ inches. The thing that made this flood so completely unmanageable was it kept raining. It not only rained 24 inches, it didn't stop. Along this whole area, there was another additional 7 inches of rain over the next 3 days. So it was an incredible amount of water. This is some pictures that I took out in Colorado. This shows what's left of a crack in the ground. Someone named V.S. Fitzpatrick, his name was Valentine Fitzpatrick. He was the publisher of the paper in Seabird, Colorado, the Seabird Settler. He was also an author, and you can still get his books on Amazon.com. They're books about cowboy stories and Indian stories. He was a very good writer. He believed that there was an earthquake at the same time as the flood, and he mapped out there on the right between Araba, Genoa, Flagler, and Seabird. That's where he thought the earthquake was. I talked to the USGS, the U.S. Geological Society, and they felt like it was from the weight of so much water, 24 inches of water, that the earth actually moved and opened up. You know how sometimes there'll be cracks after a rain when the rain is washed? Well, this was on a giant scale. The people that owned this property told me that this crack was originally about 50 feet deep and went clear to groundwater, and that they had to fence that to keep their cattle out. Another lady that I talked to about the rivers was telling me about how the ladder of rivers are. You can kind of see there how the Indians would travel on this ladder of rivers as they went down the Republican. As you probably know, the Republican River isn't named for any political party. It's named for the Pawnee Indians that inhabited this area. They were called Republican because they had a representative form of government. So that's how the Republican got its name. I don't know if any of you have been to Beecher Island. Beecher Island was where there was an important Indian battle over in Colorado. they had established this 19-foot monument. It was a monolith type monument with the names of all those who had died. After the flood, this monument was gone completely. They never found it again. They found one of the base stones. I saw a picture just yesterday of one of the base stones that they got out of the river, but they never recovered the 19-foot tower of white granite. This shows the railroads in the area. There was a train crash at the time the flood started in Vona, and there was some people that died in that plane crash, or that train crash, because the bridge was washed out and the train just went into the river. This shows the time of the crests when the rain fell during the night on May 30th. It was at 3 a.m. when the crests started, and you can see the timeline as it went on down into this area. People in this area had a little more warning because as the flood came down the river, people would go to the next town and warn them. There was a town not far from here where they had to get the people off of the bridge by gunpoint because the people wanted to see the flood come. And so they were standing on the bridge waiting for the water to come. And the sheriff had to make them get off the bridge. They'd been off the bridge 10 minutes when the flood came and the bridge washed away. They would have all died if it hadn't been for his efforts to get them to safety. All these stories are so interesting, I think, about what happened at that time. This shows the normal Republican River during the months of 35. This peak in the cubic feet per second has never been passed since. I didn't really understand what cubic feet per second was when I started this study, and I found that if you translate that into gallons, that at the time of the flood there was 1.5 million gallons of water per second going past you if you were standing in a stationary point. So it is no wonder that so many people who were in the water had no hope of getting out. I found this when I was also visiting with one of the survivors, and this was someone had done a painting of his farm at the time, and we thought this was kind of typical of what farms at the time were like. There was usually a house and a barn, maybe not always as close to the house as this one. This is a farm near St. Francis, Kansas. It's the Confer place, actually. And this is St. Francis. It's a similar place, not exactly the same place, but this is the river that split the place. After the flood, they had to move because the river actually flowed between the house and the barn. And you can see how close the river is to the house, so the channel had changed. And you can imagine if this was your farm place, how devastating that would be, because not only are your fields ruined, but your livelihood has changed. This is the highway coming out of St. Francis, Kansas. You can see there is no highway. If it wasn't for the telephone pole, you could hardly tell where the highway was. And this is some pictures I took the other day when I was visiting in McCook. This is where that Harry Strunk Memorial is that you pass on the highway. This is looking out over the valley. You can see how wide the valley is. This house is the Capel place, and I think it's over there on my board if you have a chance to look at that later. You can see the bluffs in the background, and you can kind of imagine when the flood came how trapped they were, because the water was between the bluffs, about a mile wide and about 4 miles. From west of McCook, it went 4 miles a mile wide. So they really had it's a very interesting story. You can see it on our website if you'd like to read the whole story about how the family escaped during the flood. This is an aerial view of McCook, what I just mentioned about how far the river went from bluff to bluff. It was just amazing. And this shows what was left after the flood, the huge amounts of debris. It was just a huge undertaking to clean up. I want to tell you a story about the McCook power plant. I bet some of you have probably heard that story about the McCook plant and how this had started out similar to the building that Kathy showed me a little while ago that you had here in town. It was a flour mill. It had started out as a flour mill, and then it had been converted to be a water and light plant for the city of McCook. On the day of the flood, there had been some rains, as I've mentioned before, so they were prepared for a little bit of water. They actually usually built a dike. After the flood had gone by, they would tear the sandbags back down. There were about 30 men working in the plant that morning, and as I mentioned, it was the 30s, there was a depression, and so to help with building the dike, they had called put a general call out, and about 7 or 8 men had come to pick up some day labor to help. And this is a little movie that we found, and let me see if I can get that to start from here. This is actual footage of the flood. This is in McCook. You can see the water has gotten very, very wide. It's starting to invade the power plant. The men very quickly become trapped. You'll see in a moment that their wives and their families are standing on what is now the shore. This is the homes in McCook that were damaged. You can see very quickly their homes were completely swamped. People are walking down to the power plant to see what's happening. You can see them all gathered there. The railroad tracks that used to go right by the power plant have become swamped. By the 3 doors there, you can see some coal cars. They were loaded with cinders. That's what they were filling the sandbags with. You can see the water pouring across where the railroad tracks were. You can see the water tower there, the cooling tower there on the left. The waves, as I mentioned before, it was just like the ocean. The water was moving so fast, so many millions of gallons of water. Those are telephone poles that are starting to float away. You can see the water, as I mentioned, just like the ocean, just waves flowing over. The men were trapped inside the power plant at this point. Hello. Glad to have you join us. And they were up on top of the engines. One of the men had the presence of mind to take a length of garden hose with him. This is what happened after you can see all the people from town had come down to take a look. The men were able to climb out onto the roof through a hole that they poked in the roof. The men that were on the cinder cars that I showed, they were able to get on the roof also. There they got up on the roof, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to rescue them. One of the doctors in town was a sharpshooter, and he shot out the insulators on the telephone poles and light poles that went to the power plant, and they put a telephone trolley car that would normally have the telephone repairman. They went back and forth twice and rescued 2 men, but the water washed out. There you can see where they're trying to rescue them by boat. I believe at the time there was only like 3 boats in McCook because people just didn't use boats that much around here at that time. This was before all the lakes and dams. While the men were on the roof waiting for a would-be rescue, a tornado came through and went right through on the western part of McCook. A dust storm came, so they were flooded, they were tornadoed, they were hailed on, and it was just a terrible experience. You can imagine why they thought the world was going to end at this point. So this is the picture that I showed just at the first of this presentation. This was Bob French. He's doing that rescue that I was telling you about where they were going back and forth along the wires. Bob made it to the telephone pole over there, the light pole, but when the water got too strong, it snapped the pole, and he made a perfect swan dive into the water. However, it quickly carried him miles downstream. Unfortunately, he swallowed a lot of the water, which of course was full of all kinds of nasty things, and he never regained his health after this. It was kind of sad in his attempt to save the men there. This is what the power plant looked like afterwards. It was actually fortunate that the tower fell like it did, because it broke some of that debris that was in the water, and it kept the power plant from completely collapsing, so that the men were saved and rescued the next day. These are the kind of headlines that were in the paper. It was just an incredible amount of devastation. And this is a little map that I was talking about, the railroad bridges earlier. This shows all that were out. This part of the country was completely cut off from the rest of the world at that time. People had to go back to, they had to abandon their cars and go back to using mules and horses to get around, because there were no roads. Their cars couldn't get anywhere. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this picture. This is a picture on the right there of a cottonwood tree that was planted back in the river upside down after the flood. It caught the attention of Robert Ripley. I'm sure you've all heard of it or not. He thought that was a pretty cool picture, and on June 3rd, that ran in June 3rd of 1935, that ran in every paper in the country. So everybody in the country knew where Binkleman, Nebraska was that day. 80 million people saw this picture in their newspaper that morning. So, and that's gone now. I went to see if it was still there, but it's not. It's gone. And so you're probably wondering what the purpose of our study has been. It's because we don't want people to forget about the stories, about the loss, about how this flood changed our country, because after this there was a very major effort to get the dams, to get the water control that we now enjoy for recreation and things like that. And we're looking to the future, because we not only want to study what happens in a flood like this, but we want to mark where the flood was. I don't know if any of you have noticed the markers that are like this in towns in this area. This is Mr. Niswanger, D.F. Niswanger, Frank. He lived in Cambridge, and he was one of the founding fathers. He thought that, and probably rightly so, that after 1935, people would start to argue about where was the high water mark, and was it here or was it there. So he also had a monument business for the cemetery there, so he made these monuments, these high water marks, and he put them all up and down the river. You can find them in Hagler, Trenton. There's several places. We're going to mark these places and other places like them, similar to the one that we have here in Arapahoe. We're going to mark those with a special sign, so people will again know where the high water marks were from the flood. We also have a website. I put that in your little brochure if you'd like to go there. There's stories about the flood, what the weather was like, what happened afterwards, what is still happening because of the flood, and a lot of personal stories and pictures and resources where you can go to read other great stories about the flood. And that's a picture of the signs we're going to be putting up. And with that, that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I was hoping that maybe some of you who were survivors might like to share.
I have several films or DVDs that I took of history of Arapahoe and the surrounding areas. I have DVDs of people that was involved and that was actually in the flood.
Really? Right.
And I have them at the shop up here. Anybody that, I did show a lot of them a year or two ago, but if anybody's interested in them, we'll try to put together another party or so that you can see what these people had to say that was in the flood.
That'd be wonderful. Would you maybe be willing to share those? That'd be great.
I have several hours of it.
That's wonderful. I think that's outstanding.
There's some in the museum too.
Yeah.
I have all this stuff that I've taken. It's in the museum for keeps.
Wonderful.
On DVDs.
Yeah. Very good. And I know some of you lost family in the flood. That's really hard, and I know it's hard to talk about still, no matter how long the time has been. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about that sign because, and I'll
Trip about it.
this is one we're gonna put here in Arapahoe, and it's gonna be down at the old mill, and you could probably tell more about that than I can. It's at your house, is that right?
This property is belonged to Doug and Cheryl Schutz, south of Arapahoe. You all know where their house is out there. Doug, can you tell us what were you told that building was used for, you know?
Well, it was the old flour mill, where they ground the flour in there. And then on the west side, on the door there, someone had marked on the door the high water mark of 1935.
It was something.
Yeah, and it's up there on the door. So, and then you can also see it kind of weathered with bricks around on the side.
Well, we just thought we ought to have something here to mark, because Arapahoe was about one of the few towns that didn't have water in it. It came up to the railroad tracks. Those of you that remember that, that's as far north as it came. But most of the towns up and down the valley were flooded in town, in the houses in town. But the way ours is situated between the two creeks and the river far enough south, all the loss we had, it was enough, was south of town, out where Doug lives out there, on the bottom.
We thank you for allowing us to do that. I think
Yeah.
that's important to remember.
Thank you for coming in, and, but we wanted you to see this and know that it was going to be there, and I'm sure people will be able to read it from the road as they drive along, and remember this terrible tragedy that we had, and the people that lost their lives.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or anything?
Lilia?
The water went south. My aunt and uncle lived at the foot of the bluff hill.
Oh, did they?
And it went to their yard fence.
Is that right?
It was very close to their
Yeah.
house.
You did?
And everything was the sign in the park, the some flood water.
Yeah, and I think that's one of Mr. Westmore's
What's
markers.
here and, the guy at that time, waved me about 5 miles south and then 2 east. They lived in a dugout,
Oh, yeah?
and they said he sat upon the bluff and watched
Really?
the flood come down, the trees and all that.
Really? I'll bet that was something to see.
And then my mother, they were the only ones up and down the valley that had a sister up on the hill beyond their house.
Mhm.
And my mother was the only one that had a washing machine and had water.
Oh,
And for a week or longer, she said that run every day. Some neighbor, somebody was coming in washing because they couldn't wash at their place or have water.
yeah. I'm sure that's true. I'm sure they appreciated that too. It'd be great to have clean clothes.
This lady was from the paper. Would you give that, present Doug and Cheryl, why don't you come up by the sign? And so we want a picture for the paper. Come on.
Can she just
They could have heard all of this.
Well, we don't put a sign up every day around. That's nice. We appreciate your putting it up.
We're supposed to mount that on the building?
Yeah, no, you can go on a post any way you want to do it.
Okay. You might have stepped out there. I don't want to do it, as soon as I look at it. Good.
Is that wonderful?
Are we done?
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Take it right out.
Everybody good to see you.
Okay. Don't look for it too soon.
check out our website, and other presentations we'll be giving up and down the river. So thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. Several of you have books of 1935 by Mrs. Wilmot about the flood. She had 2 large volumes of material that she had collected. And Vera Faye Lewis moved into assisted living down here, and she said, I don't know what I'm going to do with these books, so she gave them to the Historical Society. So if you're interested in reading those, you can see me and I'll check the book out to you, and you can enjoy looking at those if you'd like. I think Lydia has copies of them. A lot of people do.
Yeah, a lot of people do. They also have them in the library.
Okay. But there are some really interesting things to read and tales that people tell if you're interested. Or a lot of people have relatives, but they didn't know there was any record that anything was done. And it makes it a little more interesting.
If anybody's interested in happen to be up to Cambridge, the museum, they've got a nice museum up there. They have a lot of history of the flood in that area, Holbrook area, and I believe it even covers some of Indianola. That's in the museum there at Cambridge.
Mr. Jerry, there used to be the veteran medicine, but bluff. And this one,
That's what we're talking
oh,
about.
that's what he's talking
That's the one. And there's a sequel to that.
about. And then there's another one that's later that's
That's the one.
forward farther on up. I've got that.
Yeah, if you find any others, we're really interested in either having it at the library or the museum. It's kind of difficult in the museum because we don't have a library as such to check things out. But I would be willing to loan them to somebody if you were interested in that material. That's all that we have planned for this afternoon. I do want to encourage the people from the Historical Society, and even if you don't belong, we need volunteers to man our library, our museum when it needs to be open. And so if you would be interested in working on a Sunday, why, we have a calendar over here, and all you have to do is mark the date you'd like to sit there, and what hours. I wondered about that, if it need to be 1 to 4, but I don't know.
And it's Saturday and Sunday.
Saturday and Sunday, yeah, 1 to 4. But they don't have to sign up for 2 days, do they? No, just one. If you'd like a Saturday or a Sunday, and you like to do crossword puzzles or something else to keep yourself occupied, we would enjoy having somebody do that. One other thing for the museum members, I would like, if you have a key to the museum, I would like to know. I lost my list of who has the keys. So, okay, I think I have you on the list. So,
I've got one.
okay.
And also,
See, that's what I need to know.
while I'm talking, I want to tell everybody that the security cameras has been installed and they're in operation. We do have to make some other arrangements if you want a continuous deal on that. I found excuse me, I found a way that we can do that.
Wren's been installing security cameras for the museum because we had some articles disappear, walk away, and enough that we aren't even sure what they were. So we just know that they aren't there any longer. And so we decided we'd spend a little money and put in security cameras so that the person who's there can see on the screen, see the different floors. It's terrible that we come to that, but sometimes.
This new system that I'm talking about, well, you don't have to, the people that's there watching the door will not have to monitor.
No.
The new system I'm talking about adding to this will put it on a hard drive, and you can go back and look at it and tell when it was, who it was, and everything.
Yeah.
We're covering all the floors.
Yeah. No, we wouldn't expect the volunteers to use the machine. That's not necessary because it'll be taped, and that would be nice.
What about the Hasty family in that flood?
The Hasty family, Well, my grandfather, my granddad, Dominicus Hasty, came here in 1871 before the town was here. They were staking out. And Granddad built the first river bridge across. I found some pictures of him. I'm loaning them to Joy. She wants to make some copies for her use. Some of them of my mother and dad and the aftermath. And I can tell you a story. We used to go to Beaver City when I was a kid, and I remember definitely one day we were crossing the river bridge and my brother hit the floor in the back seat and mother said, "Get up here and look at this bridge, your granddad built it." And he peeked up over the seat and he said, "Yeah, but it doesn't sound like he did a very good job." And for those of you that aren't old enough, the old bridges were steel, and then they had wooden planking on the floors. And when you went over them, they rattled and banged terribly, especially if there was any length to it. So that's what he was referring to. And those of the younger people that are here wouldn't even know a bridge existed like that. But it was lost in '35. And I found some pictures of that. They'd taken some. Then there's an interesting picture in there of the ladies. And boy, are they dressed up. I can't believe it. My mother's one of them, Twyla Emmett's one of them. And they were crossing, when the road got washed out clear across the valley, they had a footbridge with wire on both sides. You can see it in the picture. And then people could walk along there. They parked their cars clear at the other end. And if you wanted to come into town, you had to walk across where the river had been, you know. And it was quite a while before they, of course, got anything else built in there. So that was kind of interesting. I thought they were kind of dressed up to be out looking at the flood damage, but it looked like it was a nice day. It must have been much later than that.
Kathy, didn't your grandfather also have something to do with the mill?
Yeah, that was his idea. Yeah, I had, so I can read anyway in early Arapaho, and I never knew him. He died 7 years before I was born. But he dreamt of irrigation in the valley and built a flume. And they laughed at him because it built it out of wood. You guys that work with wood know that when you put pieces of wood together, you're going to have cracks in between. Well, he knew that after you ran water through it, the wood would swell and would hold water. Well, he built a flume, and that's how they got water down to water the park and build it, or plant the trees in the park. They had a kind of a flume built to bring water here. He just had a lot of know-how about that kind of thing, and was an early pioneer here. He liked that. He was an early surveyor. When I was teaching up here, a man from the state surveying party came, and I asked him, I said, "Did you ever hear of anybody by the name of Hasty?" "Oh, yeah, DA? Sure." He said, "Well," he said, "he was smarter than most of the early surveyors because he surveyed a lot of this country." He said he'd take his measurements and then he'd write them down on a paper, and then he'd find a jar or a bottle. He said, "We're still digging up his work." He said, "Everybody else just put it in a package and it went to pieces." He said, "We don't have any records." And he said, "We're getting BS." He went, Dominicus was his name, but they all called him Wren Hasty, was my granddad. And some of the old people, when I was a kid growing up, now I'm one of the old ones, but when I was a kid growing up, they told me about my grandfather, Wren. He was a large man, tall, and liked to do things like that. Served a year in the legislature, and I don't know what all he did.
He was minus part of one leg.
Yeah, he was diabetic in the days before insulin. Lived several years with it, and Mother always said Granddad got it from the Indians. But he would get I guess when you have diabetes, sometimes you have a spell that comes on you and you aren't able to do much of anything. Really incapacitates you. And so she said that when he'd feel this coming on, they would go to the kitchen and she'd have her climb way up, and they had a poison cabinet in the top of the kitchen for poisons. And he would get down a tumbler. She said he always used the same tumbler, a 12-ounce tumbler, fill that with water, and he would take a jar of strychnine, and with an eyedropper, he'd put 1 drop of strychnine in that 12 ounces of water. And then she said he would always drink it the same. She said he didn't sip it. He started with the 12 ounces and he drank it down until there wasn't anything left. And then she said he'd get up and disappear for 3 days. He'd go to bed. They never saw him or anything, never ate, never did anything else, and then he'd get up ready to go again. And he dosed himself this way for several years. There were quite a few doctors I remember here who used to ask Mother about that. And she always thought that was something the Indians had taught him. And he was always real friendly with the Indians. We had I forgot the name, I can't remember the name of this party. They had a surveying party in the early days that disappeared down southeast of here. And they had never been able to find any trace of what happened. They just knew that they had gone that direction and no one had ever seen them again. Well, one day the Indians used to come through here. Before there were any roads here in Arapahoe, there was one trail, and it came from the northeast and came across here before we had any highways or railroad or anything. And it came through here, and the Indians would come through here, and my granddad always liked to visit with them. And one day he saw this big fella and had a shiny object on a thong around his neck. And my granddad, being an engineer, recognized it was part of an alidade off of surveying instruments. And so he asked the Indian where he had gotten this, and that was through that information then they were able to go down here and find that party that had been lost down the river down here, and able to locate them. So there are lots of interesting stories like that. Early day.
My uncle was marooned on the brick building out here, but he worked at the flour mill. And then
You worked with Jake Poole then, didn't you?
I did. I think so.
Jake used to tell me everything I knew about fishing and hunting when I was a kid. And he spent the night on the river bridge, or the creek bridge, I'm not sure for sure which one. And it's only about that wide. He spent the night there with a rabbit and a rattlesnake.
Yeah.
He said, none of us bothered each other. Yeah. There are lots of good stories. Anything else that we need to talk about? There's coffee and cookies for those who are interested. Please remember, if you'd like to volunteer, there's a calendar over there. If you're not a member, you don't have to be a member if you'd like help take care of our museum. It's pretty small, and we're awful full right now. People call us and ask us, we don't want this. We don't have any more room for any more things. We're going to have to start giving a few things away, I think, or make room. So, but we're glad you came. Thank you for coming. And Joy, thank you for making the trip out here from Goodwin.
Oh, thank you.
Anything before I adjourn? Is there anything, Laura, you need to?
Oh, I don't know. I had a couple little things, I guess.
Okay.
Just that I don't know if everybody who has a computer, if you've looked at the Arapahoe website. Everything is getting updated very quickly and constantly. And I pulled up our page, and the picture, of course, is not real recent because you've put stuff on the windows where it says Furnace Trosper Museum. But it also gives our hours, and it has at least 3 names of people to contact and our members. I wondered if anybody wanted to go on and look and see if you thought there was something else that needed to be updated besides our picture.
Any suggestions? If you have any, let us know. We appreciate anything.
And if you haven't looked through Apple's website, if you do have a computer or access to a computer, please look at it. It is one of the better ones around. Cambridge just contacted us and trying to find out who did our website, and they're very impressed with it. But, at our meeting, we get about, I think it's like 400 hits a day just on our website. So, but the website is Arapahoe If anybody wants to look at it. So,
Lori, did you have any bills we need to approve or anything?
I believe there is one at Hamilstrands. Wren got some batteries and extension cords, is that what it
Right.
was?
Mhm.
I really don't think that takes a vote of the group to pay those because we've already said we
We
were going
decided
to
we
do
should do
security
it, right.
as a whole, so I think that kind of covered in there. Anything else anybody have?
Kathy,
Oh.
some of us was wondering if anybody would be interested later on, this summer or fall maybe, of going to the, what do you call, lesson jams?
What's lesson dance?
Dancing leaf
That's
bird.
a leaf bird launch.
Okay.
I've not been up there since they moved it.
No, we
And
haven't.
they told us that if anybody would be interested, we'd go as a group, and they would make us buffalo stew that day.
Oh, that's a real interesting place if you have that in there.
At the funeral, well, it's in a Hellman's funeral, he said, you guys need to come up, and he said, I said, well, we should pack a big lunch.
Oh, just beef
And he said, they can make buffalo stew, he said, so, you guys come on up, so we need to set a date there.
Well, I think that'd be a good idea, a real good plan for this summer. Maybe nice weather, we can get up there. Sure as heck it rain. But that's the way it goes.
Should we say, make it a set date then, and
Yeah.
just kind of plan on?
Did you have to bring a certificate along?
No,
That's right.
I brought it, but I
Yeah, we
left
don't
it
need
in
it. We'll just
another
announce it.
vehicle that I thought we were bringing and
Yeah.
found out we weren't.
That's all right. They're not here anyway. Our Historical Society tries to recognize somebody who's worked in our organization. And this year, we're recognizing Delilah Monter of Elwood. And she's always been there to help us in anything that we wanted to do. And if she wasn't able to do it physically, then morally and with goodies and cookies and all those kinds of things, she always kept our group going. And so Bob's made a certificate for her, and we'll see that she gets it because she was not well enough to be here. Okay? But I wanted everybody to know that we were going to recognize her as volunteer of the year. Anybody else? I don't have anything to say. Thank you for coming. Help yourself to the goodies and sign up.
I have one more question.
Yes,
Are we gonna be meeting before the 4th of July, or 3rd of July, I mean?
we can.
Are we going to have the open house like we normally do in the museum for Pioneer Days?
Yeah, we'll just have to contact everybody and see who's willing to work. Okay? Okay. Anybody? We always need help on the 4th of July. We open the museum and we usually, that's our best day of the year. We always have a lot of visitors.
Saturday will probably be your busy day because that's when the parade will be.
Yeah.
The 4th is actually on Sunday this year.
I don't think,
Most of the events will be on Saturday.
okay. I don't think a lot of people, if you don't belong to the group, all you have to do is call one of us listed on the door over there. If you have family here and you'd like them to see the museum, give me a call, or anybody that's on the list that has a key. We'd be glad to come down and let your family go in and see the things. Because you know, a lot of times if families come, it's not when things are open. And you'd like them to see something in there, or just visit it. So, yeah.
Janet Mullering Hayes,
Uh-huh.
Scott Mullering's daughter, contacted us, and she'll be coming for a class reunion at Holbrook at the end of May. And she's bringing a map that her uncle, I think she said it was, two men anyway, from Holbrook, made a map, an early day map of Holbrook. And she's donating that to our society and Furnace County 1904 plaque book.
That's nice.
I have something I'm going to plug in.
Yeah, Bob.
Yesterday, a group of us went to Holyoke, Colorado and stuff to see the Colorado US Route 6 Heritage Corporation. They had an open house. And since I'm a past executive director for this state, we really enjoy seeing that kind of stuff, the stuff that they have. And yesterday it was on how, from McCook through Colorado, how Route 6 was made. Then I got a phone call from, while I was sitting there in Mary Tomke's office, and she is the executive director of the state of Colorado. Russ Lombard called, who is the national president. And we had about a half-hour-long talk. And I think through this talking and stuff that I've gone through, I resigned as executive director in Nebraska in 2007 when I decided to put my full efforts in the business. But I think right now, I don't know if there's anywhere here in Arapahoe that's got it, but I do have plenty of Route 6 stuff. I'm just going to tear down part of my wall and dedicate that to a visitor center. So whoever wants to stop there can stop there. I'll get my wireless feed so that if you need to stop out there, use your laptop, that's able to do it. So that's pretty much how they've done it in Holyoke. We don't need much here. And I'm thinking here in the next few weeks of seeing from Russ if they don't need a change in executive directors, and I'll probably try for that one again.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you. Been a nice day and we enjoyed